I was going to say, can we get a crossword puzzle for Mr. Plant down here too, please? Just so excellent. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say. We'll, I've got Sundays lying around because I got about 3 answers into it before giving up, so I'll have someone bring that down to Mr. Plant in order to keep him engaged. No announcements, so we'll start with Ms. Levin.
Thank you. Just a couple things. The European Health Commissioner, EU Health Commissioner, was saying that he didn't think that any non-essential travel to the U.S. or Mexico should be canceled. Is there any pushback coming from the White House or the administration on that?
I'm sorry, any
pushback? Are you guys talking to them saying we don't think that's an appropriate thing to say at this point?
I will check on the European information. Sorry, I don't know what that was. I have not seen that before. I did not see that before I came out here.
In all the stories all morning, that's something.
I would say, let me just give you a sense of what the president has done on this today, or who he's heard from. At the end of the president's daily intelligence briefing, he got a briefing on the latest developments from John Brennan. As you know, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did a public briefing today at 1 p.m. Mr. Brennan, Secretary Napolitano, and the State Department will brief at 3 p.m. today.
Who from state?
I don't know who from state, but likely in that will be an increased travel advisory saying non-essential travel, warning against non-essential travel to Mexico. Yeah.
Can you just confirm that that's what they're going to say?
I can. I can likely confirm.
So no, a warning against non-essential.
Non-essential travel to Mexico. I will point you to them in terms of the details forthcoming.
And in terms of the EU Health Commissioner, can you just follow up with that?
I will.
It used to be that if there was a question to follow up on the briefing, that there would be sort of an asterisk in the transcript or some way to
I will
get us the facts.
I'll send it to you in that pink paper that Bill has, and we'll.
And then just quickly, you talked about the president getting his update at the end of the Intel briefing. Can you just talk about his process of keeping updated and involved and kind of walk us through a little TikTok?
Yeah, we did some of this yesterday. I don't know how many briefings he ended up getting yesterday, but he's getting regular briefings from Mr. Brennan, who, as I said yesterday, is assistant to the president and in charge of the Homeland Security Council here at the White House. Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5, HSPD 5, is what denotes that Secretary Napolitano, as head of the Department of Homeland Security, has primary intergovernmental authority over these types of incidents. Again, they will brief, as I understand it, CDC at 1 because Dr. Besser is in Atlanta. Brennan and Napolitano will be brief at 3. That will happen on a daily basis to keep you all up to date on any and all developments.
Yes. Following up from yesterday's briefing here, sort of what did you know and when did you know it? The first case in Mexico was apparently either reported or the first death was, I'm not sure, April 12th. The president was there about 5 days later. Did our team learn of this during the advance or in the course of the visit?
I'm not aware that we learned until I think earlier last week. That's what I've been told, and I will double check on that.
So there was no warning or caution?
Not prior to the trip, no.
Prior to the trip?
Yes, sir.
There are growing concerns in the financial markets about potential fallout for the global economy and for those glimmers of hope and progress that the president has pointed to. If this were to turn into a pandemic, is the administration at all concerned and taking any kind of preemptive action?
Well, let me split the question in a couple different ways. The National Economic Council, Council on Economic Advisors, is obviously aware of and looking into this notion. There's, I understand, a working group at the Department of Treasury to deal with this. Obviously, what we have done and what we talked about yesterday in declaring a public health emergency in order to activate capacity and capability of this government ahead of anything was to get out ahead of any of these incidents and hopefully prevent its spread. So I think it is a little early to determine the economic impact, but obviously NEC, CEA, and Treasury are monitoring that situation and looking into it. I hesitate to get a whole lot further than that based on what may or may not happen.
Has the president at all spoken on the subject privately that any concern?
There was discussion about it here today, yes.
I know that Kathleen Sebelius, Governor Sebelius' nomination is probably going to be voted on tomorrow in the Senate, but do you guys have just the litany of other assistant and deputy secretaries at HHS as well as the Surgeon General ready to go to hit the ground running after she is confirmed, assuming she is?
Absolutely, and let me, as I mentioned earlier, the primary presidential directive for Homeland Security denotes, I know there's been some discussion about Juan Napolitano's role in this. That's why I mentioned the presidential directive that denotes interagency coordination goes to the Department of Homeland Security. And I mentioned this yesterday. There's our response is in no way hindered or hampered by not having a permanent secretary at HHS right now. Dr. Besser and thousands of people, both at CDC and throughout HHS, are responding to this. There are professional staff over there as we speak helping to coordinate this. I'm sure many of you all have called public affairs over there and gotten your questions answered. So we feel confident with the team that is there now. Having said that, we're certainly hopeful that soon-to-be Secretary Sebelius will join them without delay tomorrow.
Presumably, you would rather have a
Well,
permanent group.
we'd rather not have a swine flu. Yes, sir.
Wait, I'm sorry. Could you just, do you have them ready to go? I mean, Surgeon General, the Assistant Secretary?
There's a whole group of people there, and there will be more to follow. Some will and some won't need Senate confirmation. Yes, sir.
Can I just follow on the question of the economic impact that Matt asked specifically? There's been some chatter this morning about during the stimulus debate, there was, I think, $900 million that Democrats wanted to put in to deal with pandemic preparations. I know we're not at a pandemic stage right now, but there have been some Democrats this morning saying the money got taken out by Republicans who thought it was pork barrel spending. Any concern here at the White House about that money being taken out, and any talk about?
Before I get into that argument, I'd have to go look at the information. I would say to this, Ed, that the preparations that Congress took in 2006 were important in providing us the ability to respond now. And part of the reason, 2005 and 2006, part of the reason I'm up to date on those things is because Senator Barack Obama was deeply involved in the appropriations activities to ensure that we had antiviral drugs in the event of an avian flu outbreak. Some of the very first governmental money that went to avian flu came through work that Senator Obama did with Senator Lugar in terms of monitoring in foreign countries that didn't have the capability to recognize or the infrastructure to test what was going on. That is part of what he worked on in 05 and 06. I'd have to look specifically at the 900.
Quick follow on what Bill asked about Mexico. When the fact that the administration was not told about what had been going on in Mexico when you got there, is there any concern the Mexican government was not truthful, or is it that it hadn't been, the whole thing had not been, pardon me, formulated yet, so maybe they didn't have all the information? Or?
Without speculating on what the situation might have been, it's hard for me to guess. I said this yesterday, and there's certainly been no change in that the president's health was never in any danger. Helen?
In grading in the reporting, his report card, how does the president grade himself after 100 days in office?
I was asked this question a few days ago, and I gave the administration a B+. I think there's always room for improvement. But I think largely, I think the president and the administration are pleased with what has been done in the first 100 days. If you look at restarting the restarting credit flowing, increased financial stability, the passage of a recovery and reinvestment plan. But as I've also said, I think the American people are less likely to spend a lot of time sitting around Wednesday, judging what we've done in our first 100 days, and are more concerned with what we're going to do each and every day going forward to continue the progress that we started in the first part of this administration. So,
Does the President think it's right for the Wall Street to be getting big pay raises now? Is that
well,
right?
I think the president's viewpoint on executive compensation have been well discussed in each of these first almost 100 days. Yes.
Two questions. Quick follow-on on Jake's question. So your response hasn't been hampered at all by not having an HHS secretary, by having an acting HHS?
I mean, I'm happy to respond to
I just want.
something that you think might have hampered that response.
It doesn't. It's not a concern at all to the administration that you don't have your person there and that they don't have their people there? Not at all. Second question. Do you guys feel you owe folks in New York City this morning an apology for this incident having to do with the airplane that looks like Air Force One with 2 fighter jets? There seemed to be a lot of panic.
I would point you to FAA or Air Force.
Everybody's pointing us to the White House military office, so that's why.
Well, then I would contact the White House.
The White House military office won't tell us anything. They'll refer us to you.
Well, then let me go discuss with the White House
Are you
military.
aware of the incident?
I don't, I have seen some news reports, but I don't know. I have no information on
I mean, I
this other
understand
than what I saw.
the way this works. I'm just saying appearance-wise, it's odd that you guys don't have a response. I mean, this is the president's aircraft or what looks like.
I understand. I was working on other things. You might be surprised to know I don't know of every movement of Air Force One or what happens to it, but I will certainly talk to the military office.
New York City was very edgy about this.
What's that? Now, let's go to, yep.
Another question on this one. This is the first test for you all on potential major public health crisis. What are some of the things that are guiding you in terms of your communication on this balance between, how did the president put it this morning, reason for concern but not alarm?
Well, I think yesterday's announcement, I think in some ways demonstrates that. I mean, look, I think anytime you were to utter the phrase public health emergency, obviously, initially there would probably be a lot of concern, but understanding, as Secretary Napolitano denoted yesterday, it's very similar to an emergency declaration that one might make in preparation for a natural disaster like a flood or a hurricane that you know or can predict is coming. It helps us pre-position resources. It frees up parts of the law that have to be activated in order to do that. Yesterday, Mr. Brennan, Secretary Napolitano, and the CDC walked through all of the preparation that had previously been done. Look, we want to ensure that the public understands the steps that the government has taken, the capacity and the capabilities by which the government has in order to respond to this, to let people know and to hopefully give them information if they have questions. Again, I would repeat, go to cdc.gov. There is something obviously right there on the front home page that has frequently asked questions. There's also part of that in Spanish for people that need that. So I think we're trying to balance, as you said, ensuring that the public is aware and understands what's out there, but at the same time, what we're doing is a precaution and not to alarm people.
What, just to go back to your response to one of these earlier questions about the economic impact, you said there were discussions here.
Well, it was simply raised in one of the meetings, I forget which one I was in, that's simply a discussion that it was something that should be noted. That's why, again, we'll ask Treasury for more on their group, but just that the NEC and the CEA are monitoring
Was it one of the meetings where the president was present?
I don't believe it was, but I'd go back and check my notes. April?
On that, can you clear up what the president's contact was with Felipe Solis, the gentleman who died the day after? And, you know, we're hearing that he could have.
Yeah, let me balance let me balance exactly what Peter said. I've got no information on that. Again, I want to repeat what I've now said any number of times. Having talked to the doctors directly about this, the president's health was never in danger. The president, nor anybody that I know of traveling with him in either governmental or press capacity, has shown any symptoms that would denote cause for any concern.
Understanding that, what was his contact, though, with Felipe Solis? Can you clear that up?
Yeah, I have not talked to anybody about
Did
that.
this man actually escort the president in Mexico City? No, seriously, it is a new.
I am serious, but April, if I didn't know the answer to your previous question, extrapolating on the follow-up is going to be hard for me to provide information based on the fact that the basis of the previous question, I didn't have any information to answer.
Was the president in the room with this gentleman at least?
I can answer. Okay, and I will check on it. Again, it's hard for me to go 3 levels down when, you know, sorry. Go ahead.
Robert, the president this morning on swine flu said there was no cause for alarm.
Right.
Was he giving the American people a snapshot? We know this is a very fast-changing situation. And what should be the level of concern at this moment and going forward?
Well, I think people should be vigilant in observing what's around them. Obviously, if they, I think yesterday they talked here yesterday, if people feel sick, to take the precautions that you need to stay home. I think those are important things for people to understand. And I think it is important, as I said, that people remain vigilant, that they ensure that they're, as Mr. Brennan said, taking responsibility for themselves. The president, again, and the team here wanted the American people to understand that we're taking steps in the event that what is happening now becomes more concerning. It's enough of a concern, obviously, to take steps to begin to activate our response, and we're continuing to monitor it. And hopefully, with these daily briefings, in addition to CDC and Mr. Brennan and Secretary Napolitano, you know, the public will have all the information they need on this. Major.
I understand this is a fluid situation, Robert. You may not have the answers right now, but if you could take these questions, if you don't, and get back,
Sure.
I'd appreciate it. Is the White House actively curious about Mr. Solis and the cause of his death? He was next to the president. He was there. There's video of him on the 16th. Okay?
Let me check. Let me check.
I mean, it's a serious question.
check.
This man possibly died from swine flu.
Well, we don't know. He
And
died
we don't
from
know.
pneumonia.
We're hearing the reports possibly,
Okay.
and he possibly had contact with the president the day before. That's a real question.
A real question that I said 5 minutes ago that I would try to find out, April. I haven't forgotten.
Actively curious is it pursuing to try to find out some more information about the situation?
I will certainly check. Again, let me, hold on, but let me, I said this the other day. I'm going to try not to take it personally. That giving an answer on the 7th time has yet to break through, so let me try an 8th. I specifically asked somebody on my staff to speak directly with the doctors of the President of the United States of America. Ask them if they were at all concerned. They said no. The President, as I mentioned yesterday and on many other previous occasions, has not exhibited any symptoms that would require that to be of concern. So while I will check individually on your question, I think it's important to understand for the 8th time that there's no medical concern for the president.
Why wasn't there just in my defense, my question wasn't about that.
Well, and I said
Why
this
wasn't there precautionary on the medical front?
because, as I said this yesterday, Chuck, we have, I think it's important for both you and for the public to understand that if you, as Mr. Brennan said yesterday, if you are exhibiting symptoms, if you feel sick, to take precaution. But at the same time, let's not crush our public health or private health infrastructure with every person just going to randomly get tested despite the fact that there's no concern that they're exhibiting a symptom by which would denote that they have some reason to be concerned.
I had a second question, Robert.
Yeah.
Now, White House.
We're only up to 2?
Yes, sir.
I like the way you count.
Reflect that this is the second question.
All right.
White House
I find that
teams,
hard to
medical teams, in previous administrations, and I assume in this one, advance trips for the president. Wherever the president is going to go, medical teams go out with specific medical questions to personnel who are going to be on site where the president's going to be, and the larger medical or air quality or any type of medical concerns where the president's going to be. Were these teams dispatched to Mexico? Were questions asked about swine flu, do you know? And did you get any response from the Mexican officials either about what the president was likely to encounter or possibly would encounter?
I will ask without, and maybe I shouldn't do this, I'm not entirely sure that somebody would have asked about that given the timing, but let me.
The president arrived on the 16th, and as Bill reported, the first case was documented on April 12th. So it's possible that within that environment,
find that out.
these
But again,
questions could have been asked.
I'm going to go for number 9.
No, there wasn't a question about
No, I
the
understand.
president.
I just think it's important.
It's about communication between
I understand.
developments with the
I understand. But let's for purposes of the previous question, I just again, boy, I'm glad I'm not a public health spokesman. Let me just try this one more time. The doctors have informed me, based on my personal curiosity, knowing of yours, that the president's health was never in any danger, that he has not exhibited any symptoms, neither has anybody traveling with him, neither has any of the press that travel with him that I'm aware of exhibited any symptoms that would cause some reason for concern.
This question's not getting at that. There's a lot of speculation that the Mexican government was withholding information
I'm not,
to the United States.
Chuck, hold on, let me,
That's the
no, and I'm,
His health is not what we're asking about.
no, I'm trying to balance what somebody previously asked about concern and panic, okay? So I'm reiterating that answer as a larger global answer while I check on the other question. My ears work fine, I will check on the questions, all right? Don't tell me, let me guess. Go ahead.
I'm not going to ask about the president's health. This is a relatively new administration's first public health crisis. It's a new plan that came out of the SARS thing several years ago, never been put into place. Aside from the top officials, you have a lot of lower level, second and third tier people that have not been put in place yet. Do you guys have any concerns about sort of the overall bureaucracy's response and being able to ramp up? And are you reaching out to anybody in prior administrations or anybody outside the government to kind of help this relatively new government deal with this
I can certainly check and see if any of I assume some of the people here would just naturally reach out to counterparts in past or previous administrations. I would also point out, Michael, that a ton of this infrastructure is done at a state and local level. In dealing with cases that have been reported based on testing at the CDC, obviously, for instance, New York Department of Public Health, their school system, their local infrastructure is also key in this. But we have, we're not currently concerned about our infrastructure and our ability to respond to this. Again, this is something that I think it is important to understand is at the top of the president's list right now and the top of many of the staff that work here. We have all been involved in meetings and briefings and discussions and calls well after normal working hours to stay on top of the situation. The team will continue to evaluate whether or not there are any infrastructure demands that need to be reinforced or met a different way. Again, I think part of I think it's important what you mentioned, which is the response in many ways is about the plan that you have in place and the plans that you've taken in many ways, whether it was SARS, whether it was avian flu, both the president's interest and knowledge on this issue, as well as the preparations that were taken, we feel confident leave the government in a strong position to respond.
pass my second question on to Major.
Jeffrey.
Robert, you know, when the president was in the Senate, he had a bill early on in the avian flu scare, and both he and Senator Lugar thought that the country was not prepared for this type of crisis. Where does he think that the country is at right now on this? And have there been strides made under the Bush administration to prepare for this, your administration, or is there a great need for?
Well, I think, and I can, I don't know if I have this timeline here. Let me take a gander at this. In the early part of 2005, I think the first several months of Senator Obama's tenure, he worked on primarily on appropriating money for and authorizing money for the World Health Organization to begin to have greater resources that would be needed to test, to monitor, to notify the surrounding regions and the world of the increased prevalence of avian flu. In November, or by November of that year, there were increased appropriations dealing with both the planning for as well as the response needed for antiviral medication and other response resources. That was done with the Bush administration and members of Congress. There was a big push on that and a lot of money that was added at that point in 2005 and again in 2006 to address this. So I think the president believes that part of that work was helpful in creating that infrastructure and that plan that is now being activated to respond. Yes, ma'am.
As long as you're taking questions that you're going to get back to us on the flight of Air Force One, the aircraft this morning down along Lower Manhattan at a very, very low level. Mayor Bloomberg says he is furious. It was insensitive, poor judgment, and he would have gone all the way to the White House to stop it if he knew it was going to happen. Do you think it's insensitive to have a big aircraft flow low over an area where it's clearly such a trigger for them?
Well, I'm going to find out this information based on Chuck's question, and we'll try to get back to you with whatever details we can. Yes, sir.
Robert, when the president this morning said of the swine flu that it was cause for concern but not alarm, and you've got like the EU commissioner at first saying don't travel to North America before he toned it down saying don't travel to parts of North America. Is there a fine line here? Is the world overreacting? Have we crossed a line toward panic, and is it unjustified?
No, well, yes and no. I do think there is a fine line, undoubtedly. But I also think there is, and the president and his team believe, a desire for and a need for information in order for the public to have to make determinations, to understand what has caused the government to take increased preparations so that they can take preparations and increase their own personal surveillance as to the surroundings that they're in. Yeah, I think it's a tricky fine line, but I think what we are doing is hedging a bit more on the notion that more public information is important so that people can take the necessary precautions. Again, that information is out there on CDC website. Mr. Brennan said it yesterday. Actions that individuals can take should they feel like they're sick. One of the things to build off of Michael's question earlier, I think one of the things that gives, and Dr. Bester said this yesterday, we are at the tail end of the normal flu season, which is a good thing in terms of the overall ability to respond as the normal course of any flu that one sees each year, with the prevalence of that decreases. Yes, sir.
Robert, thanks. The New York Times reported this weekend that compensation levels for workers at the largest financial institutions are coming back to levels prior to the financial markets collapse. What kind of message do you think this sends, and is the White House concerned at all that as unemployment levels continue to rise, people in Wall Street firms are getting more and more pay?
Well, again, as I said to Helen's question, I think the White House was concerned enough in February about this issue and continues to be concerned enough about this issue for the president to issue a fairly stern warning and to begin the completion of guidelines and proposals to rein in executive pay, and I think to ensure that there's some measure in compensation and that compensation rewards success and not failure. Yes, sir.
Robert, I wanted to go back to Helen's question as well. You said you'd give the administration a B+ on its first 100 days in office. I was wondering what grade you would give the Republicans in Congress and the national leadership on their first 100 days under President Obama.
Did you put him up to this, Helen? Did you? No. You know what? I'm going to, I will let all of you intrepid reporters file equally intrepid stories judging their 100 days. And
plus or low?
I'm going to, I'd let them defend their actions, and they have very eloquent spokespeople who I think can take those calls. Yes, sir.
Robert, this is budget week on the Hill again, and you're likely to get reconciliation, at least for health. Does the president have mixed feelings about, on the one hand, having an easier time toward getting health care reform, on the other hand, perhaps irreparably damaging relationships with Republicans who think that it's, sort of heavy-handed?
Well, I guess I would disagree with the notion that a majority of the United States Senate believing something is finding that to be heavy-handed. I think the president believes that this provides, no pun intended, a little bit of an insurance policy to make sure that people are engaged in finding a solution for a problem that's vexed Congress and the public for decades. That the president believes it's time to find a solution to cut healthcare costs and to increase the number of people that are lucky enough to have access to insurance. That we have a big table and that people can and should come share their ideas from across the spectrum as to how to exactly do that. And I think it's been noted many times, there are many examples of public policy that have come as a result of reconciliation, whether it's welfare reform or tax cuts in 2001. So this is the beginning of a very important process, and that we hope that both parties and actors that are involved in the healthcare equation from across the political spectrum will work and act in good faith towards finally bringing about a solution that finally cuts the cost of healthcare. Yes, ma'am.
What are the White House views on the impeaching of Judge Bybee?
I'm sorry?
I'm wondering what the White House's view is on the impeachment of
No different than what I said last week when I said this was a congressional review. I'm sorry?
Did you know of Podesta's letter before?
I can check. Deb?
Under the debt exchange announced today by GM, the Treasury would own 50% of the company. Does that mean the federal government will run General Motors, and how would it exert its authority? And secondly, could you give me a reaction to the Chrysler UAW deal announced last night? Does it meet your requirement?
Sure. Let me take the first one first. Despite the ownership percentage that under a restructuring proposal that you mentioned as part of these SEC filings, this administration and this government have no desire to run an auto company on a day-to-day basis. We believe that, we believed that the plans that were sent forward to us needed to be strengthened. We strongly back an auto industry that we believe can and should be self-reliant of government funding, and that's the actions, that's what the presidential auto task force and the stakeholders we hope and believe are working strongly towards, but it is not our desire to either own or run one of the auto companies. In terms of the reaction to UAW as it relates to the Chrysler and Fiat, I think obviously we're pleased that it appears as if another hurdle has been cleared. I know it was, I think the president thanks all of those that are and were involved in those negotiations. And we believe and are hopeful that we can continue to make progress with additional credit holders to get a deal to merge Chrysler and Fiat ahead of the deadline and continue a strong and viable auto industry. Bill?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll come to you next. Don't worry. I love how I just point in that general direction. And
We'll take it. Looking ahead, the first Thursday in May is the National Day of Prayer. For the last 8 years on that day, there's been a prayer service in the East Room of the White House. So that would be not this Thursday, but May 7th. Can you tell us what the plans?
Now.
Can you tell us what the plans are for this year's National Day of Prayer?
Boy, most of these guys will tell you I'm so bad at the week ahead that 2 weeks ahead might be a challenge even I can't begin to overcome.
Concern among evangelicals that there will be nothing held at the White House this year. Is that true? Nothing in the White House?
I can't imagine that would be the case. I will check with scheduling and those in the faith office that would have a better idea. The president is somebody who prays each and every day, and whether it's National Prayer Day or not. Yes, sir.
Sort of a related issue, I guess. Today, the former ambassador to the Vatican, Marianne Glendon, had announced that she was declining the highest honor from Notre Dame, and that was because of the president's going to be giving the commencement speech there. Does the White House have any response to that at all?
I don't know. I have not seen whatever reasoning she might have given. I'll continue to say this. The president looks forward, greatly looks forward to delivering the commencement address at Notre Dame. Obviously, any commencement is a very special occasion for students and families that are involved. I think Notre Dame has a strong record of healthy exchange of differing viewpoints and ideas. The president is glad and fortunate to have supporters of all faiths and looks forward to delivering that commencement address.
If I could just follow up one more thing. There have been some reports that Notre Dame does expect him to wear the traditional robe of the Prayer of the Virgin Mary. Is that
I will check. I honestly don't know what the dress code is for that day, but I can assume if the president will wear what one traditionally wears for that commencement and looks forward to doing it. Thank you all.